Hey guys, and today I'm here to talk to you about engagement. Now, I know I've spoken about this before, but I wanted to talk about this in more detail. Now, there are many different ways to deliver engagement, but I want to keep this video brief, so I'm going to focus on 4 different methods of engagement. First of all, we have social engagement. Social engagement is often used in multiplayer-focused games, particularly MMORPGs. The purpose of social engagement is to build your game around the community, and to encourage players to meet and play together by presenting tasks to the player, which require cooperation and competitivity. Connecting with other players helps people become engaged, as their attachment to the social experience keeps them playing. Games such as Mount & Blade Napoleonic Wars thrive on this by allowing players to organize countless events where they can play and socialize in a Georgian-era setting. Other games, such as Town of Salim, are built on entirely social experiences, where players must outplay each other in a contest of social interaction. I believe a lot of MMORPGs could learn a lot from Town of Salim, as it is a great example as to how having few gameplay mechanics can actually make the experience more engaging. Other games that do this, for example, are Quiplash and Cards Against Humanity. I personally believe that these games are going to be the future of social gaming. As for MMORPGs, I find that they tend to overwhelm players with too much complexity, which tends to cause a divide between players and ultimately creates a more separate community. I believe this is due to the fact that the very nature of an RPG contradicts the whole idea of playing in a massively social environment with multiple players. The reason why Town of Salim and Quiplash are so popular is because they focus on the core elements of social engagement, and they do it so well that it makes a mockery out of MMORPGs. But this isn't the only issue with MMORPGs, which brings me to my next point. Another method of engaging an audience is through psychological engagement. In other words, the process of using rewarding elements as a means of manipulating players into compulsive behavior, to artificially engage the player. This is often used exploitatively to encourage players to spend real money on microtransactions to feed their compulsion. It's no secret that I am strongly against this practice, and that I strongly suggest to all indie developers out there to avoid this, as it is unethical and doesn't make your game any more fun to play. There is a difference between engagement and fun. With fun, players are engaged in a positive way. In the case of psychological engagement, this is not the case. Unless you want your game to be memorable for all the wrong reasons, avoid psychological engagement. Then we have systematic engagement. Systematic engagement involves the creation of systems designed to constantly reward players. The Badass rating in Borderlands 2 is quite possibly the most notable example of this method. These systems are designed to overwhelm players with rewards, which give them more of an incentive to play the game. Games like Diablo do this with its loot drop system and loot rankings, using rare loot to give players a brief feeling of accomplishment. Systematic engagement is all about giving players an illusion of success through growth. Unlike psychological engagement, however, systematic engagement is not exploitative, though it can cause potential psychological issues. For example, a player may be more inclined to use an inferior weapon for the sake of having a higher rarity value. Luckily, some games allow for transmogrification to combat this issue. Finally, we have kinetic engagement, which is not to be confused with kinetic empowerment. Kinetic engagement is essentially the momentum provided by the kinetic activity, which keeps players engaged in kinetic activity. A lot of shoot-'em-ups use this to keep players playing for long periods of time. The best way to do this is to give the player a perception of empowerment through thematic and mechanical design, to make them feel strong, but to also make the player feel vulnerable to make the gameplay more intense, while offering thematic cues that remind them that they're doing well. This is essentially the glass cannon effect used by games like God Hand and Devil May Cry. This also tends to go hand in hand with mastery. These are merely examples of how engagement is delivered, not how engagement is measured. Measuring engagement comes down to the game's execution. There are too many factors for me to list, as just about anything can go wrong in a video game, such as Valkyrie Profile's non-linear story, which caused more problems than it did good. As such, this requires good practical knowledge in game design, such as knowing how to pace games properly, analysing potential issues of specific gameplay elements, and game theory. Not theory crafting, don't confuse the two. In game theory, you're actually looking at the behaviour of the player when they're playing the game, and how they make their choices, whereas Theory crafting, which is what I'm doing, is coming up with theories as to how game design actually works, or how we can better game design. Just putting that out there. In any case, pacing is all about knowing what to implement and when to implement it. When you implement an event into your game, you have to be aware of possible disengagement. There are a lot of factors that go into this, but I'll narrow it down to a few examples. For starters, we have difficulty burnout. When a player is pushed through several difficult events at once, it can be overwhelming. This can disengage the player for multiple reasons. Firstly, it can frustrate the player. Secondly, it can tire the player. The player needs to be rewarded for overcoming a challenge, and in some cases rewarding the player with more challenge can be counterintuitive, and it can cause players to quit the game for the two reasons I listed. Ideally, you want a smooth wave of difficulty. You want to be careful with difficulty spikes. Remember that everything needs to have a purpose. Only add a difficulty spike if you have a significant obstacle specifically designed to be a wake-up call, or a significant challenge for story purposes. The next one I want to bring up is narrative burnout. When you overwhelm players with a high quantity of low-quality dialogue, players may find this monotonous and will usually disengage the moment that they are finished with the long string of narrative. Games such as Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky do this a lot. Essentially, this brings us back to number 4 on my How to Make an Engaging Storyline in a Video Game article. A story that fails to keep itself clear and concise can quickly become convoluted or monotonous, and both of these can be disengaging. You want to keep the player invested in what is going on in the story to maintain that engagement. You need to add elements of excitement to keep things fresh. If you overwhelm the player with too much dialogue, or you fail to bring excitement to the player, you run the risk of disengaging the player from the story. By cutting back on all the filler, you can focus on the excitement, and as a result, you can make the game feel more engaging. These are merely 2 examples of potential disengagement you have to look out for. There are many different ways in which players may be engaged or disengaged from the game, and it would be impossible for me to list them all. As a designer, it is your job to make your own judgment based on what it is you are trying to make. This is where the importance of testing comes into play. Until you test your game, it is impossible for you to know for sure if an element of your game's design can potentially hinder the player's experience. For this reason, it is important to analyze your ideas carefully and make sure they are implemented properly. Put simply, if the piece doesn't fit, don't put it in. I hope this has been helpful to you. If you have examples of gameplay elements that disengaged you from a game that you want to share, leave them in the comments. Other than that, thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.